Max Verstappen did not win the Nürburgring 24 hours. But the weekend still created a comparison Formula One could not ignore. Because while Max could step into a Mercedes AMG GT3 and chase one of the most demanding races in the world, Kimi Antonelli saw his version of the same dream become a Mercedes decision before it ever reached the track. Same dream, same brand, very different permission. That is the real story here. Not a scandal, not a fake paddock drama, a revealing comparison. On one side, Max was inside a GT3 car, away from the normal Formula One script, choosing traffic, night running, mixed classes, and risk in public. On the other side, Antonelli, one of the most protected young projects in Formula One, was being discussed through the language of timing, experience, and management. That detail matters because Max did not need the trophy for the story to matter. His presence alone created the benchmark. A four-time Formula One champion was allowed to chase the Nordschleife as a personal racing challenge. A young Mercedes Formula One driver was not given the same room, at least not this year. And once Mercedes made that call, the race result became secondary. The result disappeared, the comparison did not. The timeline is what makes this more interesting than a simple racing side story. First, Max Verstappen entered the Nürburgring project seriously. This was not a parade lap, not a sponsor stunt, and not a champion showing up for attention. He climbed into a Mercedes AMG GT3 with Verstappen racing and treated the event like a real competitive target. That matters because the Nürburgring 24 hours is not a controlled Formula One weekend. It is traffic, darkness, weather changes, amateur and professional drivers sharing the same road, and one of the most punishing circuits in motorsport. For Max, that risk was part of the appeal. Then the car showed enough pace to make the project credible. The Verstappen Racing Mercedes AMG GT3 was not just circulating, it was competitive. It had moments where the entry looked capable of fighting near the very front, and that changed the political meaning of the weekend. Because when a driver of Max status enters a race like this and the car has real pace, the story stops being about curiosity. It becomes a statement about what kind of racing still pulls him in. Then came the technical issue. A drive shaft problem took away the final result. That is important because it keeps the story honest. Max did not complete the clean victory arc. He did not turn Nürburgring into some perfect domination story. But the failure did not erase what had already been shown. The entry was serious, the pace was real, the risk was public, and Max had chosen all of it. Now put Antonelli beside that. Antonelli became linked to the same Nordschleife idea through the permit route. But instead of seeing that ambition reach the track immediately, Mercedes held the line. Not this year, that does not prove fear. It proves caution, and the caution makes sense. Antonelli is not Max Verstappen yet. He's not a completed Formula One story. He's still a young driver, being shaped by a manufacturer system, by expectation, by future value, and by every headline that could attach itself to his development. So the comparison becomes uncomfortable. Max takes the risk in public. Antonelli has the risk discussed before it reaches the car. Max gets freedom because his status can absorb consequence. Antonelli gets protection because Mercedes still carries part of the consequence for him. That is why the Mercedes decision matters. The team was not rejecting Nürburgring as a racing dream. Its own GT program gives the event real meaning. The issue was who was allowed to carry that dream. And once that became clear, the story stopped being about one race. It became about freedom, permission, and the quiet politics of who gets trusted with risk. Now look at the pattern. For Max Verstappen, fans see a champion chasing another racing challenge. A driver who has already won in Formula One, already built his place in the sport, and now wants to test himself somewhere less polished, less controlled, and far less predictable. A Mercedes AMG GT3 at the Nürburgring is not the same world as a Red Bull Formula One car. There's no clean air guarantee. There's no perfect race rhythm. There are slower cars, night traffic, changing conditions, and a circuit that punishes small mistakes with very large consequences. But for Max, that risk belongs mostly to him. That is what status does. When Max chooses the Nürburgring, it reads like a champion expanding his racing life. If it goes well, it adds another layer to his reputation. If it goes wrong, the damage is limited by everything he has already achieved. His story is already written in Formula One. Antonelli is in a different position. Fans see hunger. Mercedes sees exposure. That is the uncomfortable part. Antonelli wanting the Nordschleife does not make him reckless. It makes him a racing driver. It shows the same instinct fans usually say they want from young talent. Ambition, curiosity, bravery, the desire to learn outside the narrow Formula One machine. But inside a Formula One team, that same instinct gets processed differently. Antonelli is not just a driver with a dream. He's a Mercedes project, a future asset, a young name attached to a major manufacturer, and every public mistake would not belong only to him. Fans see growth. Mercedes sees consequence. That does not make Mercedes wrong. It makes the boundary visible. Because Formula One teams love to sell bravery. They sell risk, speed, courage, pressure, and drivers living at the edge. But behind the scenes, teams manage consequence very carefully. They know which risks create value, which risks create headlines, and which risks could damage a driver before his story is strong enough to survive them. That is why Mercedes becomes the political center of this story. The brand itself did not need to reject the Nürburgring. Mercedes-AMG has deep GT credibility, the event fits the image. The machinery fits the image. The racing culture fits the image. The issue was not the race, the issue was the driver carrying the race. With Max, the same Mercedes badge becomes part of a champion, choosing a dangerous challenge in public. With Antonelli, it becomes a question of whether a young Formula One driver should be allowed to attach his developing reputation to a circuit where one mistake, one crash, or one bad headline can move faster than context. Fans see a racing dream. Mercedes sees a headline it cannot fully control. And that is where the same risk starts changing owners. Because this was never only about the Nürburgring, it was about ownership of risk. When Max takes that risk, the consequence belongs mostly to Max. Han has the titles, he has the reputation, he has the leverage. He has enough history that one difficult weekend does not define him. The Nürburgring can add something to his story, but it cannot easily rewrite the whole thing. When Antonelli takes the same risk, the consequence belongs partly to Mercedes. That is the difference. If Antonelli succeeds, Mercedes gets the credit for producing a fearless young driver with range. But if something goes wrong, Mercedes also has to answer the harder question. Why allow that risk now? Why expose a developing Formula One driver there? Why place that pressure on someone still being built inside the program? That sounds like a safety decision, but it also reveals something else. Max is not asking for a key to the building. He already owns a room inside it. Antonelli is still being escorted through the front door. That is the hierarchy. Not talent, not desire, not racing instinct, hierarchy. Max has earned the right to make certain risks look personal. Antonelli has not yet earned enough political space to separate his own risk from Mercedes' risk. And once you see that, the whole story looks different. The Nürburgring entry stops being a side quest. It becomes a picture of what freedom looks like after dominance. Antonelli being held back stops being a simple no. It becomes a picture of what ambition looks like before full power. The important word is not no, it is not now. That phrasing matters because it keeps the door open while still showing who controls the door. Mercedes can say the dream is not dead. Mercedes can say experience matters. Mercedes can say the timing is wrong. All of that can be rational, but rational decisions can still reveal power, and the uncomfortable implication is simple. The more valuable a young driver becomes, the less freedom he may actually have. Because every risk becomes bigger than the driver, every result becomes part of the project. Every failure becomes a question for the team. Every ambition has to pass through the people responsible for protecting the investment. That is not a conspiracy. That is how Formula One power works. And this is where Max and Antonelli become perfect opposites. Max shows what happens when a driver has enough leverage to choose risk in public. Antonelli shows what happens when a driver has enough value that the team wants to control when that risk begins. One driver can make the Nürburgring look like freedom. The other has to wait until freedom fits the plan. So the question is not whether Antonelli should be allowed to chase it tomorrow. The question is sharper than that. At what point does protection start to become limitation? The proof is not one single moment. It comes from three different places. First, performance. Max did not win the Nürburgring 24 hours. That matters because this was not a perfect victory story. The technical issue took away the result, and without that result, it would be easy to treat the whole thing as a side chapter. But that would miss the point. The Mercedes-AMG GT3 had already shown credible pace. The entry had already looked serious. Max had already taken the risk in public, in traffic, at night, on a circuit where one problem can erase an entire weekend. The trophy disappeared. The evidence did not. That is why the project mattered before the final classification ever arrived. Max did not need the win to make the comparison visible. He only needed to show that this was not symbolic. It was real racing with real risk against a race that does not care about Formula One status. Second, management. Mercedes did not reject the Nürburgring as an idea. That is the key distinction. The brand understands GT racing. The car belongs there. The event belongs to that world. Mercedes had every reason to respect the race, support the machinery, and treat the Nürburgring as part of its wider racing identity. The hesitation appeared when the driver was Antonelli. That does not make Mercedes wrong. It makes the decision more revealing. The issue was not whether the Nordschleife was valuable. The issue was whether now was the right time for a young Formula One driver, still being shaped inside the Mercedes system, to carry that risk in public. The important word was not no, and that is where the future tension begins, because not now can be reasonable today. But how long can a team keep saying it before protection starts to feel like control? Third, politics. A champion can absorb reputational risk differently from a young driver still being built by a manufacturer. Max can have a messy weekend and still return to Formula One as Max Verstappen. His history protects him. His titles protect him. His status gives him room to choose risks that look personal. Antonelli does not have that same room yet. If he succeeds, Mercedes gets a great story. But if something goes wrong, every outcome becomes a Mercedes story before it becomes fully his own. The question becomes why the team allowed it, why the timing was right, why the risk was worth it. That is the cost of being protected by a powerful system. Your opportunities can grow, but your freedom can shrink at the same time. So the real danger for Mercedes is not only that Antonelli could fail at the Nürburgring, it is that every step outside the normal Formula One path has to be managed before he has enough leverage to own the story himself. And that brings the comparison back to Max. Max did not win the Nürburgring, but he showed what freedom looks like after dominance. Antonelli showed what ambition looks like before full power, and Mercedes showed the difference between trusting a champion and protecting a future one. That is why this story should not be treated like a random GT entry or a young driver being told to wait. It reveals one of the quiet rules of Formula One. The same dream does not belong to every driver in the same way. For Max, the dream reaches the track. For Antonelli, the dream reaches a meeting first. And maybe that is the final question this story leaves behind. What happens when Antonelli earns more leverage? How long can Mercedes keep saying not now? And when he finally wants the same freedom Max already has, will the team still call it protection, or will Antonelli start to hear something else?